This is how you cross over from Israel to Gaza, and right now we're in no man's land. Prime Minister, do you now regret when once asked what your favourite joke was, you replied Nick Clegg? And Deputy Prime Minister, what do you think of that?
Mr. Trump, why should you be president? What makes you fit for the role? Is it just one big ego trip?
Thank you very much.
People aren't sure they can trust what you say. You say things and then it turns out that they're not quite what you said. My name's Andy Bell and I've been a journalist for over 30 years with the BBC, Sky and ITN. In this podcast series, How Did We Get Here?, I try to provide context and background to a big story in the news by talking to someone with real insight. For this edition, Boris Johnson wants his time as Prime Minister to be defined by levelling up, making the poorer parts of the country as prosperous as the richest. But does he have a plan? Does he have the will? Does he have an understanding of what is needed to do that? I've been talking to Michael Heseltine, Lord Heseltine, who back in the 1980s pioneered what we would probably call now levelling up. He has strong views on how it should happen, and he reveals this government thinks it's worth getting his advice as well. Lord Heseltine, thanks very much for talking to us for How Did We Get Here? Levelling up. When you hear the Prime Minister Boris Johnson talking about levelling up, do you feel you understand what he's getting at?
No, not really, because he's had 2 years to implement a policy proposal in the form of a white paper, and we still haven't had it. So I'm afraid we get a lot of exhortation and a lot of the traditional Whitehall policies of central decision-making imposed on areas of relative deprivation. But what we haven't had is a coherent strategy.
Let's just go back to your experience of this. You're famously associated with working in Liverpool in the early 1980s. When you were doing that, did you think of that as levelling up, or how did you think of it?
I think that one has to go back to 1979, where I started on a major pair of renovation projects, one in Liverpool, one in London. And both were centred on areas of very considerable deprivation. The east of London had little investment and was very public sector dominated. The docks had gone downstream, the utilities had moved away and left a lot of contaminated land. The banks of the Mersey were toxic, 600 acres of toxicity. So these were two conspicuous and large-scale areas of deprivation. The same policy was applied. First of all, put somebody in charge. Secondly, give them the machinery with which to devise local strategies, and then the resources necessary to implement. Those were the three fundamental ingredients of what we did. And of course, in their way, they have worked over a period of time extremely well.
I'm just wondering, what was different, though, in that approach? Did you feel you were pursuing something very different to just saying, well, here's a problem, maybe the local council can deal with it, or the local government departments in the normal way can deal with it? There was something that was actually specifically different about the way you approached it?
It was a fundamentally different approach. That there'd been no such coherence in a strategy, no such very obvious leadership, and never the provision of resources in the round. You'd had lots of initiatives where people had said, let's build some houses or let's have a bypass, whatever it is. What we'd not done before is to take areas of deprivation and then focus on their requirements, regardless, so to speak, of the specific function we were talking about. There is a precedent of a sort. Of course, the new town arrangements in the post-war period, they had very much the same techniques and resources and concentration of decision-making. So in a sense, you could say that what I did was to use the concept of the new town corporation to deal with deprivation in urban areas.
I mean, you were still a minister from the central government and from a Conservative government coming into areas where there were largely There were local authorities, local councils who presumably thought this was their job, and a lot of those would have been Labour councils. I mean, was there a tension there?
Yes, the Labour councils all opposed what I was doing, but so did the Conservative County Council on Merseyside. In other words, I was intruding into what they thought was the responsibilities of local government. My own departmental officials were opposed to what I was doing because they saw it as, again, another intrusion into the proper responsibilities of local government. What I knew is that local government had had responsibility for decades and had provided no effective answer to the problems of deprivation that were so acute.
You also mentioned the money. I mean, presumably you had to fight to get some serious money that would make a difference.
Indeed, because the Chancellor of the Exchequer of the time, Geoffrey Howe, was opposed to what I was doing, as was Keith Joseph, who he saw it as an interventionist policy he disapproved of. But Margaret overruled both of them and came out in support of what I wanted to do.
Were you surprised that she was supporting you in that way?
No, I think the history of Thatcherism has been much rewritten by fans of one aspect of it. The real world was actually often very different.
You mean that she was actually in favour of the state intervening with public money when necessary?
Well, I pioneered that policy for deprivation, and not only did I begin it in places like London and Liverpool, but ministers who were very much of a different political persuasion within the Conservative Party, like Nick Ridley, continued with development corporations in Tees Valley and in Manchester when I was no longer in the government.
But it sounds as if Margaret Thatcher quite early was a supporter of what you were trying to do.
Yeah, I mean, without Margaret Thatcher, I couldn't have done it because it required a major policy initiative, and she overruled her two principal lieutenants to let me do it. So, without any doubt. But perhaps even more revealing is that when I had left government, Margaret personally intervened to make a phone call to the man who was responsible for building Canary Wharf and urged him to come to London. He'd been very successful in New York in development there, to look at the opportunities that Canary Wharf provided. He came and he decided to make the investment. So Margaret personally intervened in order to give the East End development project a push in the right direction.
Okay, well let's spool forward a few years to now. What's the first thing you would be saying to Boris Johnson to say, if you're serious about levelling up, this is what you have to do?
Well, the first thing I would say he's just done, because Michael Gove has been put in charge of a committee of the relative ministers who have a direct involvement in regeneration, housing, transport, education, skills. So that is the first thing, to get central government into a position where it actually can take a coherent view, as opposed to each minister simply looking at his own responsibility and devising policies relevant to that responsibility without reference to the coherence of a strategy on the ground. So the first thing, literally in the last few weeks, has already happened. 2 years too late, but nevertheless it's now happened. The second thing is to coordinate the responsibilities of government at a local level. At the moment, if you were mayor of one of the great cities, you had a project in the round, you might have to make 7 or 8 phone calls to find out what central government thinks. And that is unacceptable. The right thing to do is to have coordination of government local offices and the quangos under a senior civil servant in the provincial capitals, so that there is the ability of central government to look at the problems in the round. Now, that's an important decision in order to get central government thinking about deprivation as a whole, many-faceted challenge. At that stage, you have got to invite response from the local people. After all, they live there, they work there, they know what the opportunities are, what the strengths and weaknesses, and so they've got to devise strategies relevant to their own individual areas. These great metropolitan areas are vital in our history economically, but they're all very different. And so if you really want to get them motoring in the way that levelling up implies, you've got to do a detailed analysis, and you've got to unite the strengths of the community, whether it's public or private sector, whether it's third sector, whether it's academia. You've got to get everybody working to the same purpose, which is to rebuild the great Manchester or the great Liverpool or the great Newcastle. So you need the mayors. And the mayors have not been given anything like the chance that was intended for them, but that's the next step. And in order to get them the resources, you say to central government, you've got to accept that your budgets may be spent in response to local needs and opportunities rather than fulfilling your transport or education or housing specific policies.
Is there a tension, though, between saying, there's obviously a strong role for central government, and you mentioned Michael Gove, and he has a cabinet position and such responsibilities to drive it, and also saying the mayors of the great cities must have more say? Is that a tension that's going to get in the way of levelling up?
Yes, it is a tension, but it doesn't need to be an impossible hurdle. What one is really thinking about is a partnership between a central government, which is entitled to see the implementation of its manifesto policies, and local strengths under local leadership that, within the constraints of the national government's policies, design and implement the policies of regeneration. And one of the things that I found, and I think it's probably true that I have worked closer with more Labour authorities than most people, is that actually there's very little party political debate in the implementation of regeneration policies. I mean, look, you're looking at deprivation, you're looking at slums, you're looking at areas of wasteland, and it's quite difficult to turn that into a doctrinal debate of left or right. You've got to get people building, you've got to get people with ideas, you've got to get investors. And I've been privileged to work with a very large number of Labour authorities in which there really was no party political distinction. Indeed, if I may say so, perhaps one of the most tear-jerking moments of my life was when the mayor of Liverpool asked me if I would accept the freedom of the city. He had 68 Labour councillors behind him.
And you found that quite a moment for you?
I find it a great emotional moment, I must be quite frank.
What about the local mayors? Do you think they should have more powers, and do you think there should be more of them in more places?
I think that, first of all, the government's manifesto said that the mayoral powers of Manchester would be extended to all the other mayoral authorities. They said that 2 years ago. There's absolutely no justification for not having done so. They should get on with it at once. The second point is that there are areas which very much need mayoral authorities. For example, Nottingham Derby, possibly Southampton, Portsmouth, maybe Plymouth. And there are ludicrous anomalies, particularly Newcastle, where Gateshead is left out. So we need to rationalise the great metro authorities. Probably one authority for Yorkshire would be a wonderful world brand. Then the next area are the counties. It's absolutely essential to avoid the political dilemma of the county areas feeling that they've been left out and the people there feeling they've been deprived. Absolutely vital for the counties to be brought in on the urban regeneration, the rural regeneration programs. That requires leadership. That should come in the form of directly elected mayors. It requires a framework that is effective. That means getting rid of the districts so that you have unitary counties as proposed, nearly 50 years ago by Redcliffe Maud. the last serious analysis of Britain's local government structure. So, yes, we need more mayors, we need clearer responsibilities at a local level, we need a structure that reflects the capabilities of the local people, and we need a directly elected mayor so that you have the ability to get decisions taken and implemented.
All of that implies both power and money being transferred from the centre. Do you think central government is amenable to that? Has that shifted at all, or is it still a great resistance to decentralising in the UK?
Well, that is the dilemma that any government faces. Because the great barons of Whitehall, whether it's the secretaries of state or their civil servants in their departments, well, turkeys don't vote for Christmas. They like the idea that they can devise policies and say, well, bypass here, new school there, whatever it may be. And if someone comes along and says, look, you're going to have to share these decisions based on local strategies devised by the elected mayors of the area, they immediately say, well, that's going to diminish my role. And I lived with all that in the 1980s, and it's just human nature. But the Prime Minister's got a big majority, and he should know, after all, he was Mayor of London and a successful Mayor of London, he should know of the opportunities that come if you actually work with and involve local people in solving their own problems.
And the Prime Minister has talked about himself as being a Brexity Hezza. What did you make of that?
Well, Boris took over from me as Member of Parliament for Henley, so we had a good personal relationship, and I've always got on very well with him when he was Mayor of London and I was helping the Cameron government. So there's well, look, there's no doubt that on Brexit we are right at the extreme ends of the opposite horizon. Brexit is a disaster, as every day that passes unfolds. The Hezza side of it is the jury is out. I think, look, COVID has been a nightmare, I can understand that, but the COVID threat is now hopefully, mercifully diminishing. And if there's going to be any entitled to him being a Hezza, he better get off his bottom.
Clearly, I presume he means by that he is somebody who believes in using the power of the state and the resources of the state to intervene where it's necessary. But you feel yet he hasn't really demonstrated that?
He hasn't shown the understanding of the need to involve the local strengths and opportunities, and to get people to lead those communities and implement the policies which the government and the local council or local mayor agree in partnership to pursue. So whilst he said things which sound good, most of it, build back better, they're slogans. What is needed, and whether you're on the Brexit side or not, the urgency is to help this country to help itself in the very stretching world in which we now find ourselves. That cannot be done by relying on central government. The most ludicrous example of this a few weeks ago was an announcement of millions of pounds to clear the chewing gum off the streets. Now, which government department dreamt that up? Look, I'm in favour of clearing the streets with chewing gum, but the idea that a central fund should be devised in Whitehall and local authorities invited to bid for bits of it is preposterous as an example of Build Back Better.
Do you think this Prime Minister is going to be somebody who will seize this and push it through and have the attention to detail, frankly, and the concentration to make this happen?
Well, he's taken the first critical step in putting Michael Gove in charge. We don't know what's going to be in the white paper, but we're told that it's not going to be long delayed now. And so when the white paper comes out, we will see whether Michael Gove's reputation for solving problems and getting results has been permitted by the Prime Minister, who will have to sort of say some quite uncomfortable things to some of his colleagues, because they won't all go with enthusiasm along this devolution route. But he's got the majority, he's got the authority, he's got the experience to say this is what we are going to do. But look, watch this space. When I have the white paper in front of me, I will know whether this is slogan or policy.
I can't let you go without asking you more broadly about the nature of this government. You obviously served under two prime ministers, different cabinet setups, that kind of thing. When you look at the way this government functions and the way it is led from the top, what do you make of it?
Well, a piece of historic fact. I first worked in government as a minister for Ted Heath, then, of course, Margaret Thatcher, then John Major, and then David Cameron. So 4 prime ministers, but close enough to the centre to feel that one was part of the team. And I think trying to take a perspective on this, Boris Johnson has really got 3 legs to the chair. There's Brexit, there's COVID, and there's the domestic agenda of rebuilding or build back better. Well, we're not going to agree about Brexit. That is a disaster. COVID undoubtedly has been a preoccupation of horrendous nature and urgent nature, which any government would have found extraordinarily difficult. It looks as though it may mercifully now be something over which they've got a grip, and it's not going to dominate the political agenda in the way that it has. That releases the energies of government to get on with the Build Back Better agenda, which we've discussed at length. That is the area in which the jury is now out. One last point, there's no short-term solutions. I look back on East End London and Liverpool with some pride. But I know how long it took. There is no short-term way of rebuilding and regenerating communities.
And the final question again on this Prime Minister, what about the standards he sets? What about the example he sets? What about the character he brings to the top of government? Do you have thoughts on that?
I have thoughts, but am I going to express them?
Go on. Would you rather not express them?
I have a cloud of silence about me.
I can almost see it sitting over you there. Okay. All right. Well, Michael Heseltine. All right. This will be my final question. Do you think Boris Johnson can pull this off? This is presumably his bit after Brexit. Levelling up seems to be what he's wanting to define his time in government by. Do you think he can pull it off?
Well, look, I'm going to make the most arrogant of claim. If he really thinks that he's a Brexit Hesse, the Hesse could do this overnight.
Has he asked you for any advice on this?
No.
If he did, would you be happy to advise him?
Well, in fairness, Michael Gove has spoken to me about the agenda, but I have no idea what he's going to do. He only asked for my opinions.
Was that recently?
Yes.
Since he got the job?
After he got the job.
Well, we will see what becomes of this agenda. Michael Heseltine, Lord Heseltine, thank you very much for talking to us.
Thank you.
Michael Heseltine revealing that the man whose job it is to make levelling up work has been tapping him for advice. If you have thoughts on this or ideas for any other podcast, you can email me on andy.bell@itn.co.uk, and I'm tweeting it at AndyBell5News. And please share, rate and review. Thank you for listening to this edition of How Did We Get Here? There'll be another along soon.